All right, so we're going to go through and talk about extrema. Extrema are your minimum and maximum. They are basically the same thing we saw in quadratics, depending on how it was opened. Except that when you're looking at higher order polynomials, you may not have an absolute minimum or maximum. You would have rather what's called a relative minimum or maximum. So for instance, if you look at the graph that you see here, you can see that this piece right here where it's kind of up highest, even though over here it goes up and up forever, this is kind of the highest stopping point. So that would be our relative maximum. When we look at a relative minimum, we are looking at this piece right here. So it is our place, even though it is not the lowest because this side goes down and down forever, it is the lowest stopping point on this particular graph. So we're looking at minimum and maximum in relative form, okay? So we're going to look at some of those on our calculator later and be able to go through and find those. Now let's talk about zeros. So zeros of a polynomial are the part that might be called the x-intercept. So we find it on the x-axis, that point where it touches. It might be called a zero. That is still the same thing as the x-intercept. It might be if it's in equation form, we might set the equation equal to 0 and say we are solving it or finding a solution. But all of those are finding out that x is equal to a. Now, we can also look at zeros in factored form. If you remember when we factored before, we could take something and say x minus 2 times x plus 1. And then we could set it equal to 0 and say, all right, I got x minus 2 equals 0 and x plus 1 equals 0. So that would mean x equals 2 and x equals negative 1. So if I got a 0 like x equals 2, I could take it backwards to say that it is the factor x minus 2. So factor is another way that we can find zeros. So we're going to look at a couple of examples where we've been asked to find some of that information. So here in example 3, we're asked to find all the real zeros algebraically. Ask algebraically, most likely they're asking you to try to factor. So if I look at this, I can see that this x cubed minus x squared minus 2x has a GCF. The GCF is x. So that leaves me with x squared minus x minus 2. Well, then if I look at this x squared minus x minus 2, I can look to say what multiplies to give me negative 2 and adds to give me negative 1. Well, that is x minus 2 times x plus 1. Well, remember that GCF of x has to come back down in front. And I'm going to stick this whole thing equal to 0. And if I put it equal to 0, then I'm going to take each of the factors and set those equal to 0. So I'll say x equals 0. My x minus 2 equals 0, and my x plus 1 equals 0. Well, if x equals 0, that's the solution, x equals 0. If x minus 2 equals 0, that means x equals 2. So there's another 0. If x plus 1 equals 0, that means x equals negative 1. So those would be my zeros, okay? I may list them and say my zeros are negative 1, 0, and 2, if I want to put them in numerical order. Okay, so I can list them that way. Or I can just say x equals 0, x equals 2, and x equals negative 1. All right, let's look at number 4. In number 4, we are asked to find all real zeros and the relative extrema. Now, they didn't ask me to find the zeros algebraically, but I'm going to go ahead and see if I can. So I'm going to set it equal to 0 and see if I can factor. If I notice it has a GCF of 2 and a GCF of x, and I don't really like that negative sitting in the very front, so I'm going to say the GCF is negative 2x, which leaves me with x squared minus 1. Well, that x squared minus 1, that's a difference of squares, right? So x plus 1 times x minus 1. So I've got negative 2x times x plus 1 times x minus 1 equals 0. And remember, I want to take each of the factors and put them equal to 0. So negative 2x equals 0. which if I divide tells me x is 0. X plus 1 equals 0, which tells me x is equal to -1. And x minus 1 equals 0, which tells me that x is equal to 1. So I have 3 real zeros. Now, remember, because I didn't say algebraically, I could have used our calculator. So we could go in our calculator, type it into y equals, go second trace, and find the zeros that way. We can also go through and find our relative extrema in our calculator. In fact, as of right now, our current knowledge, we do not know another way to find those relative extrema other than our calculator. Okay, now eventually we'll learn how, but for right now, our knowledge tells us to find it using the graphing calculator. So that's what we're going to do. And unfortunately, I can't get the calculator to pop up in this video, so I'm going to have to close this video, and the next video, part 3, you will see me going through the calculator part.